This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and get going. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Opportunity Zones 101 webinar. This is the third virtual webinar in the Rise Ohio program series. Rise Ohio, short for the Resilience Initiative for Southeastern and Eastern Ohio, is a U.S. EDA Assistance to Coal Communities program led by Ohio University, Buckeye Hills Regional Council, and Ohio Mid-Eastern Governments Association, also known as Omega. This program is designed to provide you with technical assistance to communities focused on opportunity zone planning, specifically economic diversification, development, education, and investment traction. So my name is Joel Glasscock. I'm a senior project manager with Steadfast City, as I've likely met with a lot of you on this call. We are an economic and community development consulting firm focused on developing better through a holistic approach, really geared towards converging the public, private, and philanthropic sectors together. On the slide are other members of our team you may be familiar with, and our project partner, Ray Daphner, with Strategic Advisory and Investment Services. So I want to quickly show our other upcoming webinars throughout the series, currently scheduled for the third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. This schedule with session links can be found on our resource page, which I'll show you how to access on our next slide. When looking at these upcoming webinars, please think of others in your network that may benefit from attending. Next month, the topic is broadband and infrastructure, which I know is very relevant to many of the communities throughout this Ohio region. So I want to mention these sessions are open to everyone. So feel free to pass along the meeting links and to raise awareness on important topics for your area. So as mentioned, I want to share the resources that are being made available as part of this series. If you scan that QR code with your phone, it will take you to our FAQ form where you can submit any questions. All the questions will be added to the FAQ page and uploaded to the resource folder, which can be accessed through this link. And what I'll do is I'll also place this link in the comments section. That way you have it right there and ready for you. You can take it from there. The resource folder also has webinar Zoom links, webinar recordings, a glossary, and opportunity zone resources. So a good place to check out if you're looking for additional materials. Check real quick, see if we have anyone else joining us. Okay. So today we are privileged to have Mr. Jimmy Atkinson joining us. He is the founder of Opportunity DB and host of the Opportunity Zones podcast. He founded Opportunity DB in 2018 to promote opportunity zone investment through data and media, specifically through his influential podcast, where he brings in the most prominent voices on the topic. So today's session will be focused on opportunity zone basics, what we're calling a 101 crash course, if you will. If you have any questions as we go along, please send them to us via the Zoom chat feature. There will also be a Q&A period after the presentation, which will address any and all questions pertaining to the topic at that time. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jimmy to present and share his great expertise. So I will close down my portion of the screen share, and then Jimmy, you can go ahead and share from your side.
Well, thanks, Joel.
There we go.
Perfect. Let me get my screen share up.
Good deal.
All right, here we are. Well, first of all, I want to thank Joel and the others at Steadfast City and Rise Ohio and Omega for having me on today. I'm very pleased to be with you. Good morning, everybody. We're going to be talking about opportunity zones today, of course, and this is meant to be a real crash course. And I like to start with this graphic because it kind of encapsulates what I think a lot of investors are seeing right now is they've been walking along paying their capital gains tax when they make large exits or trigger any other type of capital gains events. And they're starting to catch on to opportunity zones being a pretty good option for them. So today is really meant to be a pretty high level overview of opportunity zones. And specifically, it's going to be looked at through the lens of investors, high net worth individuals, corporations, with capital gains who regularly or episodically trigger capital gains and are looking for a landing spot for them. And a quick legal disclaimer just before I really dive in. I always do this before beginning of all these presentations. This is not to be construed as investment advice or tax advice for anybody watching, but is meant for general information purposes. Please consult your advisor before making any decisions. So who can invest in opportunity zones, first of all? And I'll also kind of shift because I know I'm speaking to folks who are on the economic development side of the table, trying to attract capital into their communities. But again, this is meant to be kind of a high level overview and looking at opportunity zones as an investor would, and hopefully giving a lot of the folks watching this today a little bit more fluency in opportunity zones and have a little bit better background on why the program exists, who can take advantage of it, and ultimately how you can use it to attract private capital to your communities. So who can invest in opportunity zones? First of all, it has to be US taxpayers who have capital gains. If you don't have capital gains, the tax benefits of the program don't really apply to you. At the end of the day, it's a capital gains tax benefit program, and it's really meant for accredited investors. And there's a very lengthy definition of what an accredited investor is, but suffice it to say, it's ultimately high net worth or ultra high net worth individual investors or family offices or financial advisors or other wealth management firms who command a lot of private capital. And it needs to be patient capital also. Unlike other types of investments, an investment into an opportunity zone or into an opportunity zone development, in order to take full advantage of all of the tax benefits, it needs to be held in place for at least a decade. So the investors have to kind of meet all these criteria before they even really are sufficiently able to be an opportunity zone investor. A little overview of the agenda that I'm going to be going over today. And I like to think of opportunity zones as the greatest tax incentive ever created. And unfortunately, it's still a pretty well-kept secret. And every day that goes by, this being a perishable tax incentive, we get closer to the end of the road for opportunity zones. A little asterisk there. There may be an extension coming at some point in time. But also, every day that goes by, more and more people get with the program, I think, and they kind of realize that opportunity zones are out there. They become a little bit more aware of the opportunity in opportunity zones, and hopefully today's one little step forward toward furthering the education and awareness of this program for more individuals. We'll go over a policy background, some facts and figures, both nationally and in Ohio. I'll go over some technical terminology, so again, you can just be a little bit more fluent on which language to use, which terms to use when speaking about opportunity zones. And then I'll go over the actual tax benefits themselves, why they're so powerful. It's essentially, to cut to the chase, it's unlimited tax-free growth, and that's why I call it the greatest tax incentive ever created. Some of you on the call may be familiar with 1031 exchanges or DSTs and how those types of investment vehicles drive transactions in real estate. And I'll speak to how opportunity zones compare with those two common programs. I'll go over some state tax conformity, what other states have done, and specifically what Ohio has done. I'll touch on in the Ohio section. Cut to the chase, the good news is Ohio is actually doing a very good job of promoting opportunity zones. I don't think there's a state in the country that's done a better job of highlighting opportunity zones than Ohio has. We'll go over some qualified opportunity funds and some marketplace and legislative updates. We'll kind of wrap up the conversation today. So some policy background on opportunity zones. First and foremost, there was an economic recession, as you know, about 12, 13 years ago, 08, 09. And in the ensuing recovery, wealthy areas all over the country recovered pretty quickly and pretty well. Low income areas got left behind. So we had some income inequality, some economic inequality all over our country for a very long time, and the gap widened and the inequality problem worsened following the Great Recession and the recovery from it. So the policy challenge was, how can we incentivize wealthy individuals to deploy some of their wealth into these low income areas? We want to create new jobs. We want to increase the local tax base. We want to drive new business development in these areas. We want to build new real estate in these areas. How do we do that? What's a policy tool that we can use? Not just another government program to get more government dollars printed, or not another tax credit program, but an incentive to drive private capital into these areas. And the solution, or the proposed solution, has been opportunity zones. And the opportunity zone policy was passed as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under President Trump at the end of 2017. But the idea for opportunity zones actually goes back several years prior and was the brainchild of a few individuals at a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Economic Innovation Group. They've been working on this opportunity zones concept since I believe 2014, 2015, when President Obama was still in the White House. And actually, they moved the ball across the goal line much quicker than they had anticipated, getting it packaged into that large tax cuts program just a few years later under President Trump. So the incentive here is, and I'll go over this in great detail in a moment here, but the tax incentive for private individuals who deploy their capital gains dollars into these low income census tracts, these opportunity zones, they get both a tax deferment period and then tax-free growth within their opportunity zone fund. And policy goals here in offering these benefits are twofold. One, to create investment return and massive tax savings for the investor, that carrot, right, to lure them to place this capital into these low income areas that have typically been left behind. And then the other goal is economic revitalization for the downtrodden communities themselves. So I spoke a little bit already about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was the act that officially enacted opportunity zones at the end of 2017. That act, as you may recall, was passed along partisan lines. I don't know that any Democrats signed on to that bill, but the opportunity zone provision within that bill itself was bipartisan in nature. It received huge bipartisan support for the years that led up to its eventual passage as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. And it continues to have bipartisan support. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the program today. And again, it's an economic development tool that incentivizes private capital investment in low-income communities. To go over the timeline a little bit more here, the legislation was passed at the end of 2017, and it was kind of buried in that huge tax cuts bill. And it took a while for the states and local leaders to kind of glom onto the fact that opportunity zones were a thing. So the actual nomination period was rather rushed in some areas of the country that weren't aware of its passage. Each state from all over the country got only a few months to nominate their opportunity zone tracts to the Treasury Department to get officially designated. And that designation took place in July of 2018. That's when the opportunity zone map was finalized. And then it took another 18 months before we got final regulations from the IRS. That's the governing body that regulates this entire program. As I mentioned a minute ago, it is a perishable tax incentive. It's set to sunset at the end of 2026. And we've already had a couple of benefits expire at the end of 2019 and at the end of 2021. There's been a somewhat common misconception that opportunity zones aren't worthwhile anymore as of the end of 2021. That is not the case. I liken the reduction benefits that I have on that a second to last bullet point as the cherry on top of the sundae. So you're missing out on the cherry if you didn't get in prior to the end of 2021, but there's still that massive sundae underneath that's very much alive. So we'll go over some facts and figures now about opportunity zones, and I'll show you the map on the next slide. But there are over 8,700 census tracts that have been designated as opportunity zones. 35 million residents of the United States live within these opportunity zones, and it takes up roughly 12% of the land mass of the country. I have estimated that approximately $100 billion of equity has already been invested into qualified opportunity funds as of the end of 2021. I'll talk a little bit more about the marketplace and the size of it and the impact that that's having toward the end of the presentation today. Here's the map of the continental United States. My apologies to Alaska and Hawaii. They have opportunity zones as well, as does Puerto Rico. In the bottom right-hand corner of the map, you can see that darkly shaded area. I'll get to that in a second. You can see, though, all over the country, we have opportunity zones, and what each governor of each state was able to do, and the mayor of Washington, D.C. as well, they were able to nominate up to 25% of their low-income census tracts, and they borrowed the low-income definition from the New Markets Tax Credit section of the Internal Revenue Code. If you may be familiar with that, they use the same definition for opportunity zones, and so roughly 25% of the low-income census tracts in each state have been nominated as opportunity zones, and you can see they're spread all over the country here. Each state has at least 25 of them. Some states have hundreds. I think California has over 800. Ohio has 320, I believe. And you can see some of them are much smaller than others. The census tracts themselves are population based. Down in Puerto Rico here, Puerto Rico got a special exemption from the 25% rule. They were able to nominate 100% of their low income census tracts as opportunity zones in an effort to help them recover from the hurricanes and the earthquakes that devastated the island right around the time the opportunity zones legislation was getting passed. So I know all of you on the call are Ohio based. So I wanted to throw in some extra information about Ohio specifically. As I mentioned, there are 320 census tracts that are designated as opportunity zones in Ohio. One quick caveat, and I failed to mention this a minute ago. The opportunity zone census tract designations use the 2010 census map. These geographic designations were made in the spring of 2018, as I mentioned a moment ago. Now we have a new census map from the 2020 census, but it's important to know that map, those geographic boundaries of those census tracts don't quite line up one-to-one necessarily with the 2010 map. So we're still using an old map to determine where the opportunity zones are. Just because we had some of the census tract boundaries maybe redrawn slightly here and there, that doesn't mean that there are new opportunity zone areas or decertified opportunity zone areas just because of the 2020 census. We're still using the 2010 map. Those opportunity zones, those physical boundaries are locked in place for the next several years. Ohio doesn't actually have a lot of rural tracts compared to a lot of other states around the country. I think only about 57 of their 320 are rural, about 18% or so. Let's see, a couple other fun notes here about Ohio that a lot of other states don't do. Actually, I don't know that I've come across another example that's quite as powerful as this. Ohio offers a 10% tax credit to any qualified opportunity fund that invests all of its assets in Ohio opportunity zones. So that's a pretty nice cherry on top of the opportunity zone sundae. Some states like California and New York have completely decoupled from the opportunity zone program entirely and don't want to have anything to do with it, it seems. And Ohio's leaning all in on opportunity zones. They're trying to make it a priority. Senate Bill 225 was passed just last month, and that extends these tax credits even further for the next several years. Let me see if I can pull up that data right now here. Actually, this is a summary from Novogradac here I'm showing on the screen right now. Governor Mike DeWine signed legislation this week. This is just about a month ago here. Cut to the chase here. The amount goes from $50 million to $75 million in terms of available tax credit money for both this year and 2023. Drops back down to $50 million in 24, settles at $25 million available thereafter. The tax credits are fully transferable also. Let's see, getting back to the presentation here. I did want to go over some Ohio facts and figures as well. So let me pull up my website here, opportunitydb.com. We have a list of opportunity zones and opportunity zone funds for every state in the country and Washington, D.C. as well. Here's our page for Ohio, and you can kind of peruse this in a little more detail a little bit later if you're interested, but we list the number of funds that we found that are investing in Ohio currently. I don't think this is an exhaustive list. We also have a list of every single census tract in Ohio that's been designated as an opportunity zone. You can sort this by county, by income level, by poverty level. Let me kind of scroll down here a little bit here. Ohio opportunity zones by city is another feature that we offer here. You can kind of see, breakdown by city, the number of OZs, and some demographic data. But just let's see, and then also by county, we do the same thing here. So you can kind of see how your county may compare to others in the state. So here's what I wanted to show was Ohio opportunity zones versus other states. A couple of things that kind of popped out to me was the household income is very low in Ohio's opportunity zones compared to other states. There's a much higher need for economic revitalization in Ohio than there are in a lot of other states all around the country. Some of these states have rather high levels of income, and sometimes that's affected by the cost of living in those states. But I found it interesting that Ohio's so low down this list here. Different governors, different state leadership prioritized had different priorities when they made their census tract nominations to the Treasury Department to get certain census tracts designated as opportunity zones. And Ohio, it seems just from the data here, really prioritized their very lowest level of income opportunity zones much more than other states did. Poverty rate is 5th of 50 states. So very high poverty rate in Ohio's opportunity zones at 32%. And then home value and is also very low. Education's about median age is roughly in the middle as well. Anyways, I didn't want to spend too much time here, but just wanted to make you aware of some of the data that we have available on our website. If you wanted to check it out a little bit later, there's the URL there at opportunitydb.com. Getting back to the presentation here, here's the map of Ohio and the different census tracts that are available all over the state. Again, 57 of the 320 opportunity zones in Ohio are rural. The balance are urban. Pretty large cluster in the major cities up here in Cleveland, in the middle here in Columbus, and down here in Cincinnati have the bulk of the opportunity zones, and then kind of dotted throughout the west and south. The east and southeast portions of the state are a lot of the larger rural opportunity zone census tracts. I wanted to move into some technical terminology here. These terms get kind of used interchangeably, and just wanted to give you a little bit better fluency in opportunity zones. So we have a QOZ, or a qualified opportunity zones, or an opportunity zone. And that is the actual physical place on the map. Sometimes that term gets conflated with the next term, which is qualified opportunity fund. The fund is also known as the QOF, or the OZ fund. That's the actual investment vehicle. That is the entity that can take in private investor capital and raise money, and then ultimately deploy that money into investable assets, real estate, business development within the opportunity zones. Sometimes I'll get a call from somebody who asks me, hey, how do I set up a new opportunity zone? And sometimes he is referring to the physical location. Sometimes he's referring to a fund. So again, just be aware of the fact that those two terms do get conflated sometimes, but technically speaking, the zone, the OZ, is the physical location on the map, and the fund is the entity that can bring in capital and deploy it to the different investable locations, investable assets inside of the QOZ. And to answer the question, no new opportunity zones can be created. The map is locked in place at the moment. It would take an act of Congress in order to add more zones. You can, however, create funds, and it's rather simple and trivial to set up a qualified opportunity fund. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation today. And then we've got these more esoteric terms here: qualified opportunity zone property, qualified opportunity zone business, and qualified opportunity zone business property, also known as that alphabet soup there, QOZP, QOZB, and QOZBP. Suffice it to say, for our purposes today, this is just a 101. Those are the different assets that a QOF, a qualified opportunity fund, can deploy capital into. Finally, section 1400Z is the internal revenue code section that defines opportunity zones and lays out how they can be used. So grab a sip of water here, and then I'm going to go over the opportunity zone tax benefits. Again, kind of looking at it through the lens of an investor, why opportunity zone investing is so attractive for high net worth individuals. And again, just to kind of rewind, the benefit really starts and ends with a capital gain event. So the very first thing that has to happen is an investor, and again, it has to be a high net worth or ultra high net worth or a family office investor who has triggered a capital gain, and a capital gain can be triggered from anything. So unlike a Section 1031 exchange, if you're familiar, it doesn't have to be a real estate gain. It could be a gain that results from the sale of a business or collectibles or Bitcoin even. Any type of capital gain has to be initiated first, and then typically you would have to pay a sizable capital gains tax bill to the IRS and possibly also to the state that you're located in if they have a capital gains tax rate. Instead, that investor rolls the gain into a qualified opportunity fund within 180 days. There are two main tax benefits. Benefit number one is a deferral period. You get to defer recognition of that gain until the end of 2026. So essentially, it's an interest-free loan from Uncle Sam for about 4 or 5 years. Benefit number two expired. That's why I have it X'd out here in this presentation. If you watch old presentations or read old literature on the Opportunity Zone program, you'll see this benefit being explained, but it expired at the end of 2021. I'll get into that in a minute. Benefit number three is the big one. This is why Opportunity Zones are so attractive. Benefit number one, number two are fine, but benefit number three, which is now benefit number two, is really the most powerful reason for investing in Opportunity Zones. It eliminates capital gains tax liability after holding on to your Opportunity Zone investment for at least 10 years. So I'll walk you through an example. Again, it's from the perspective of an investor. Let's say a taxpayer has a $10 million capital gain. Again, it doesn't really matter what it comes from. He sold his business. He sold some real estate property. He sold his Apple stock. It doesn't matter. $10 million capital gain comes in. Normally that's gonna, equate to a huge tax bill. 23.8% is the current federal capital gains tax rate for most types of capital gains. I'm ignoring state tax right now to keep it simple. I'm actually not sure if Ohio has capital gains tax rate or not. I should have looked that up. Normally, that means that the investor would have a $2.38 million tax liability due the next April, on April 15th. And it would leave him with only 7.62 million net to work with. But instead, the investor within 180 days rolls over that $10 million gain into a qualified opportunity fund. That investor gets three benefits. Well, now it's two. But benefit number one is that deferral. So again, it's an interest-free loan. And in this case, in our example, it's a $2.3 million interest-free loan from Uncle Sam. So instead of only having 7.62 to invest, you have $10 million to invest. So it's not really just like you're getting an extra $2.38 million. You are, but also you get the additional value of compounding of that additional money into the new investment over time. And the important thing to note here is that that tax on that gain does eventually come home to roost. And it will get taxed at the 2026 rate. Now, we've been thinking for a while, especially when the Democrats came into office in the White House, when President Biden was elected, and when they took control of both houses of Congress, that the capital gains tax rate was going to go up. It hasn't happened yet, but it seems likely that at some point, capital gains tax rates may rise, and that rate is going to apply to that going back one slide, that $10 million capital gain in this example makes some investors a little bit jittery, but I like to walk them back from the ledge and explain, well, in the long run, it's to your benefit. This becomes even more powerful if tax rates rise. So benefit number 2 was a reduction amount, and this benefit expired on December 31, 2021. What this did was it gave the investor a 10% reduction in the amount of gain that investor had to recognize when they went to recognize their gain in 2026. So instead of writing on your tax return in April of 2027 that you had a $10 million capital gain in this particular example, it would get reduced to a $9 million capital gain. You'd still owe taxes on that $9 million amount, but it's essentially a 10% reduction in the amount of taxes that you would owe. There was a 15% reduction that was available, and that benefit expired in 2019. So you don't have to worry about this benefit anymore, but if anybody comes to ask you about it, if it's still available, it's not. Benefit number 3, which is now benefit number 2, but I keep benefit number 2 in there just to make sure that people are aware that it did exist, but now it doesn't, is the elimination. And this, again, is the big one. You pay no tax on capital gains realized from an OZ investment, so long as you hold it for at least 10 years. It's the policy is trying to incentivize people to hold their money in these zones for at least a decade. And it's essentially tax-free growth, or a super Roth IRA, as I call it sometimes, within your opportunity zone investment. Let's say the $10 million grows to $50 million over time. That'd usually be a very large tax bill, almost a $10 million tax bill when it came time to divest of the property from the perspective of the investor who placed that capital into a qualified opportunity fund. But now it's zero due. So it really helps from an investor perspective. It really helps with the after-tax returns of an investment. 2 similar investment assets, one's an opportunity zone, one is not. The opportunity zone returns are going to shoot through the roof compared to the non-OZ investment. And again, if tax rates go up, this benefit actually becomes more valuable over time, as you can see. Let's see. This table's fairly detailed. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I did just want to explain to you that oftentimes real estate investors specifically will use a very similar program that helps them escape capital gains, and that's called a Section 1031 exchange. Sometimes a Section 1031 exchange can be accomplished through a Delaware statutory trust, or a DST. You may have some familiarity with these programs, you may not, but essentially what a Section 1031 exchange does, and this only applies to real estate investors. So if you have capital gains from selling stock or selling business or selling highly appreciated Bitcoin or any other type of collectible, the Section 1031 exchange does not apply. So it only applies to real estate investors. But essentially, the Section 1031 exchange allows a real estate investor to take gains from, and actually the entire net proceeds of the sale of an appreciated real estate asset and roll it over into a replacement property, continuously chaining together exchanges over the course of an investor's career or lifetime, and never paying capital gains. And then upon death, the value of the building steps up in basis to fair market value, which essentially results in the investor's heirs never having to pay any capital gains tax at all. So opportunity zone investing is somewhat similar to that, and it allows an investor to escape capital gains tax liability, but you don't have to die first. You only have to hold for 10 years. Some of these other lines in here, let me go over this real quick here. Some of these other lines in here are a little bit too detailed for today's presentation, and I want to make sure we don't run out of time. I'd say probably the 2 of the biggest differences are the focus of an opportunity zone investment and also the geographic restriction. So focus on the 1031 investment or on the opportunity zone investment has to be on ground up development or substantial redevelopment of a property, whereas a 1031 exchange can be more stabilized assets, cash flowing assets. Opportunity zone investing is a little bit more opportunistic. I'll get to that a little bit later on. And then the geographic restriction, of course, is pretty big. Opportunity zones, you're limited to working with those 8,700 plus census tracts all around the country, or the 320 in the state of Ohio, most of which are low income. With a Section 1031 or a DST, there's no geographic restriction. So I'll leave it there for that. Other considerations with regards to OZs versus 1031s. Sometimes an OZ can be a fallback for a failed 1031 or DST investment. Oftentimes an investor will be preparing to do a Section 1031 and they'll fail the 45-day rule, which is the time period in which they have to identify a replacement property. But if you fail the 45-day rule, you still have 135 days left to do an opportunity zone investment, possibly. I heard another example from a qualified opportunity fund manager that I interviewed for my podcast a week or two ago, and he said that oftentimes what happens also is you will find your replacement property doing a Section 1031 exchange, and what happens is you'll start to get into the nitty-gritty of the deal, and especially these days with rising interest rates and cap rate compression, what's happening is you get a little bit further on and you realize, wait a second, this deal's not really making any sense. And he's seen a lot of potential 1031 investors unwind their 1031s and end up rolling over their capital into opportunity zones instead. So kind of move along here now. I don't want to talk too much about 1031s. I want to make sure we have enough time. But if you have questions, let me know, and I can see if I can get to those. So we've been talking about opportunity zones and the tax benefits that I just went over apply at the federal level. And most states around the country either do not have a capital gains tax rate to begin with, or they have fully conformed with the federal incentive. Sometimes that, depending on which state you're in, sometimes states automatically conform. Sometimes they have to actually pass legislation to conform with new tax incentives, tax programs. So if you look all over the country, there's only 5 states in the country that currently do not conform with this program: California, Massachusetts, Mississippi, New York, and North Carolina. And in parentheses, there are their highest marginal tax rates for this year. So Ohio really has a nice competitive advantage compared to a lot of these other states that are facing a fairly large headwind. If you're an opportunity zone investor and you deploy capital into California, you're going to get all of the federal tax benefits, but you're facing potentially a headwind as high as 13.3% in state capital gains tax rate. Same with New York, 8.82, and the other states listed there. So I say this just to point out that there are a lot of states all over the country that have fully embraced and adopted opportunity zones and want to see them succeed, and are using that economic development tool as a way to incentivize private capital to come into their communities, come into their states. Other states have rejected it, or think that it's too politically charged. The fact of the matter is, this incentive, although it was written in bipartisan fashion and kind of conceptualized while Obama was in the White House, it was passed under President Trump, and it got labeled, for better or worse, as a Trump program. And so it is a little bit of a politically charged topic, even though it does continue to enjoy broad bipartisan support at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. There are some that see it still as a Trump program and have decided to pull away from it because of that. Organizations, investors, the mainstream media, and certain states across the country as well. And I think maybe in the case of California and New York, maybe they figure, why are we giving up this tax revenue? People are going to come to us anyway. We don't need to incentivize them any further. And they may end up being correct for that. But Ohio has really leaned in to the incentive. And as I mentioned, they've gone beyond just fully conforming with the federal incentive. They are also offering a 10% tax credit on top. So I've got a handful of slides left. I know I'm running out of time here, but I'll try to get through them in the next few minutes, and then I'll stop and take some questions. Again, all of these, in order to really achieve the full benefit of the program, you have to invest not just directly into private business or real estate within an opportunity zone, but all the funds have to flow through what is a newly created investment vehicle called a qualified opportunity fund. And when I look around the marketplace of available qualified opportunity funds, I really see two main types of funds that have taken shape. One is a fully integrated fund that is developer led. The developer, who's actually boots on the ground, builds the buildings, is the one who's leading the fund. Another type of fund that I see is a wealth manager, asset manager leads the fund, raises the capital, and then they partner with different developers all over their community or state or country, depending on what their investment mandate is. What a qualified opportunity fund is again, it's a new investment vehicle. It was created by Section 1400Z, and all opportunities on investments have to flow through this type of fund. It's very easy to set one up. It's essentially an LLC or a corporation that fills out one additional tax form each year, IRS tax form 8996, to just self-certify or elect to be treated as a qualified opportunity fund. Now, the IRS is the one who regulates the opportunity zone funds, and in keeping with the spirit and intent of the policy and adhering to the policy initiative, they're not going to let you just set up a fund and without actually performing some real economic service to the communities that you're deploying the capital into. So there's a lot of requirements for qualified opportunity funds in order to meet the spirit and intent of the legislation, but there's the two main ones I'll cover today are one, the 90% asset test, and then two, original use or substantial improvement. 90% asset test means that 90% of the fund's capital has to be deployed into the actual physical opportunity zone census tracts within a certain period of time. And then the other key component is it has to be either new construction, original use, that's ground up construction of a new building or a new business moving into an opportunity zone, or you have to substantially improve an existing structure, an existing building, an existing city block. You cannot just buy and hold a stabilized cash flowing asset for 10 years and not do anything to it. That would defeat the purpose. And there are many more requirements, as I said. Qualified Opportunity Fund, I already kind of mentioned this, that it's a self-certified regarded entity, typically an LLC or a corporation. And there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of these funds in existence today, and there's no limit on the capital that can be raised by qualified opportunity funds. Another probably the second largest economic development program in the United States right now is the New Markets Tax Credit Program. That's capped currently at, I think it's $3.5 billion per year. There's no cap on how much money qualified opportunity funds can raise. It's not over. There's no oversight from any government body that determines award money for this qualified opportunity fund or that qualified opportunity fund. No, you simply start an LLC, you self-elect to be treated as a qualified opportunity fund with the IRS, and you start raising capital, and then you deploy the capital into these areas that need it most. There are some risks for the investor. I don't need to go over this. Marketplace update. Just to give you a sense of the scope, the scale of opportunity zones, I estimate that $100 billion of OZ equity has been raised already through the end of last year. I base that estimate off of a couple of different reports and surveys, and I won't get into detail on that. If you have questions for me on how I got to that number, I can kind of clue you in. And then if you take into account other parts of the capital stack and debt, I estimate that there's probably $500 billion of opportunity zone projects in existence currently at some stage in the development pipeline. A legislative update. This is important. The Opportunity Zone Initiative, as I mentioned, was passed as part of the much larger Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under President Trump at the end of 2017. It hasn't been reformed at all by Congress. There hasn't really been anything that's come through Congress since then that has reformed the policy or added to it at all. There have been various bills introduced by different senators and congressmen over the last several years, but none as powerful as the one that was introduced just this April which is the Opportunity Zones Improvement, Transparency, and Extension Act. It's sponsored by the original co-sponsors in the House and the Senate, notably Democrat from New Jersey, Senator Cory Booker, and the Republican senator from South Carolina, Senator Tim Scott, who teamed up on the original legislation in 2017. They've now teamed up again with various co-sponsors from the House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle. Truly a bipartisan and bicameral legislation that has a lot of weight behind it. And it would essentially do several things. It would extend the tax benefit for an additional 2 years. Instead of having the program sunset at the end of 2026, it has its sunset at the end of 2028. That would also reopen some of those benefit number 2, the initial gain reduction benefits that was crossed out on my presentation. That's another reason why I kept it on here, because those could open up again if this legislation passes. It would expand some reporting requirements for the funds, so we have a little bit more transparency into how well the initiative is working. It would decertify some opportunity zones that have become high income over the last several years and no longer qualify. And it would allow for fund of funds. It would allow for qualified opportunity funds to invest in other qualified opportunity funds, or feeder funds, if you will, which would kind of help further oil the marketplace. That's it for my presentation today. I'll stop here and take any questions. Some additional resources on the screen, though. My website, opportunitydb.com. I have a podcast that you can listen to if you go to opportunitydb.com/podcast, or just open up YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes, and search for Opportunity Zones Podcast. You'll find it there. A few other really great resources. One is Novogradac. They are a national services firm, and they have a lot of great insight into opportunity zones. They were the one who had that little blurb written up about the Ohio Senate Bill 225. There's the URL for their OZ Resource Center at novoco.com. Accelerator for America has an investment guide specifically designed for cities and communities to help attract capital into their opportunity zones. acceleratorforamerica.com. And then finally, under the previous administration, President Trump launched an opportunity zones working group or coalition that put out a lot of great resources. This hasn't been updated in a while. The new administration hasn't made opportunity zones a priority, but the Department of Housing and Urban Development still has a lot of great resources, and most of them are at that URL right there, opportunityzones.hud.gov/resources, and including there's a rural opportunity zone resources guide within that section. So with that, I'll stop there. Joel, I'll see if we have any questions or if there's anything else I can go over for you.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, Jimmy. So yeah, if anyone has any questions out there, feel free to ask, chime in. You can send in the chat or unmute as well. Either way works. I'll just give it a few moments. Jimmy, there is one that I wanted to ask.
Sure.
How large in terms of capital investment does a rural project typically need to be to consider opportunity zones as a financing source?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if this pertains specifically to rural projects, but I have seen a pretty wide range of qualified opportunity funds out there. I've seen them as low as 7 figures, $5 million or so, and I've seen them as high as 9 figures. I've seen $100 million funds, $200 million funds, $500 million funds that have had various levels of success. There are some funds out there, and they're mostly, I would say, multifamily real estate funds that have raised several hundred millions of dollars of capital. But then, going down to the lower end of the spectrum, certainly I think, if you have a project that's much more modest in terms of its capital needs, I would say even as low as, a few $1 million, you're probably pretty well positioned to try to attract opportunity zone equity in one form or another, either through setting up your own fund or partnering with an asset manager or a developer to help bring those assets in. But I don't know if there's a real hard cutoff in terms of a minimum size, but I'd say a few $1 million.
Okay, great. And then we do have a question here from Robert Naylor. Thank you for sending this in. He asks, are there qualified opportunity funds that invest regionally, cited in Accelerator for America?
Are there opportunity zone funds that invest regionally? So in my experience, I have seen funds that invest regionally, yes. Typically, funds actually won't have a national investment mandate. They will be more limited in scale. There are some that have national mandates, but oftentimes funds are focused on either specific projects. So you may be a developer that has a real estate deal in a very particular location. It's one deal that you're working on and you realize it's in an opportunity zone. So they'll set up a fund around it to raise capital specifically for that one asset. Other times developers are already focused on one particular city or one particular region of the country. And for any project they find that fits in an opportunity zone, they'll kind of pool together one large opportunity zone fund and just deploy the money appropriately into the projects that end up falling into opportunity zones. And then you do have other funds out there that do have broader geographic mandates, or that they're geographic agnostic. They're really just looking for good deals in good locations, but they'll seek them out nationally. So you get a little bit of both, I would say.
To add to that, your website, I believe, the search engine will tell you if there are certain regions that the funds will invest in, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So I have done my best. I'll try to bring that up now, actually. I do have, let's see, a funds section on my website here. I'll see if I can pull that up real quick. And there is a filtering mechanism here. It's a little bit limited, admittedly, the ability to filter by location. We really are only able to do it at the state level, but you can kind of pick any state you want to. Let's, for instance, pick Ohio real quick here and see what this comes up with. And I'll apply the filters. But you can also, do this by asset class or property type or a few other indicators there. And here are the funds that we have found. And I don't think this is an exhaustive list. In fact, I know it's not an exhaustive list, but here's the funds that we have found that are raising capital for 4 different projects in Ohio. And these may not be exclusively Ohio, but they at least have some sort of Ohio component in their funds.
So in a follow-up to that, so how would you attract one of these general Ohio funds to a specific area or a specific development in an OC?
Sure. I mean, you can start by, establishing relationships with these different fund managers. We have contact information for a lot of these funds on our website here. If you click through, typically we have the contact information. Let's see, toward the bottom here. You can just reach out to these people and just say, hey, I see that you are deploying some capital into opportunity zones in Ohio. We have a great community here in our county or in our city. Will you consider taking a look? Here's a guide on the different assets that we have in our community. Here's the infrastructure we already have in play. We're looking to team up with a developer like you, maybe some sort of reach out like that. And I didn't touch upon this too much in my presentation today. It was really meant to be very high level. And also you should understand that, the types of opportunities and stakeholders I work with typically are the funds and the investors themselves. I don't interact too much with community or community development intermediaries. I was very happy to do this presentation to for me to get a little more exposure to folks like yourself. But these other resources on here, particularly Accelerator for America and HUD, have some really excellent resources. All my way of saying that when you start asking me about attracting capital communities, I'm admittedly a little bit out over my skis a little bit, but I would urge everybody to take a look at those last two resources in particular on this page, Accelerator for America and HUD's Opportunity Now website. And I think, I would hope at least, that the folks you have speaking on your other presentations on opportunity zones later on this year would have a lot more to say about that very topic.
Thank you. And then
Hey,
we'll
welcome.
have two more quick questions here. One asking about extending benefits to contiguous properties that are not actually located in the OZ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
and then any legislation that may allow that.
Yeah, so that's a good question here. Let me see if I can pull up again that Ohio page here, and I'll kind of go over what I think this individual is talking about, which is the issue of contiguous tracts. So I kind of glossed over this when I was going over opportunity zones. I referred to them as low income census tracts as defined by the New Markets Tax Credit section of the Internal Revenue Code. It borrows that same definition. But in fact, there was a little caveat in the language of the statute that allowed for up to 5% of the total number of opportunity zones designated by each state to be non-low income tracts, but they had to meet certain criteria and run contiguous to low income tracts. I won't bore you with all the different criteria because it's boring, one, and also I don't have it on the top of my head. But in Ohio, there are 3 such tracts that are non-low income contiguous here, as you can see on this page. 317 are low income, 3 are non-low income. I think if we go to this page here, this will show by each state how many are low income and how many are non-low income contiguous tracts. I've abbreviated non-LIC contiguous tracts. Most states have a low number of non-low income contiguous tracts. And I think what happens is some people get wind of the fact that there can be contiguous tracts, and they think that opportunity zone capital can be deployed into any contiguous tract, and that's not the case. What has specifically happened here is that was a definition and a list of criteria that had to get met in the spring of 2018 when the zones were initially designated. So you cannot meet the opportunity zone compliance criteria by investing into a tract that is contiguous if it's not officially designated, certified as an opportunity zone. It has to be an opportunity zone. Some opportunity zones are non-low income contiguous. Most of them are not. It's a little bit tricky to try to explain that, but I think hopefully that answers the question. Bottom line is it has to be an opportunity zone. You cannot invest capital into a non-opportunity zone. Or I should say, actually, you can't invest a substantial amount of the capital. Like if you remember, I'll try to pull this up again in the presentation here. Give this a second to load. Qualified opportunity funds have to meet a 90% asset test. So 90% of the capital that's raised by a qualified opportunity fund, in order to continue to meet the compliance requirements of being a qualified opportunity fund and not run afoul of any penalties, they have to deploy 90% of their capital into opportunity zones. Well, that means 10% of their capital could be deployed elsewhere. Could be, typically they're held in cash reserves or used for other purposes, but they could technically also be deployed into non-opportunity zone locations. So that would be, I would say, the one carve out there. That was a mouthful. I hope I answered that question. I hope I didn't confuse anybody from that. Did that clarify things?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Jimmy. I know we're 1 minute past 11 a.m., so we'll end with a quick last question here. I know for performing due diligence on a potential fund partner, obviously we know we have resources such as your website to research funds and where they operate and minimum investment requirements. Is there any other insight and recommendations you have for that due diligence when you're looking for these qualified opportunity funds?
Oh, wow. Well, you know, at that point, I might employ some professional services. I might have a real expert look at the potential firm that you want to partner with, the developer or the asset management firm or the deal. You know, I might get a CPA group involved, an accounting firm involved, just to run some tests on whether or not they're complying with the actual certain compliance requirements of the fund. I would also possibly bring in a tax attorney or a business attorney or an opportunity zone attorney specifically to look at the deal, and that would be my recommendation. You know, when you start going down the route of actually getting ready to partner with somebody or to bring funds in or to invest into funds, you know, I think you want to get professionals involved. So I think that would be my one piece of advice there, is to, you know, take a good look at employing the services of a tax accountant or tax attorney. That would be my recommendation there.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us today, Jimmy, sharing your expertise. Fantastic information. Your website is a great resource for anyone interested in opportunity zones, qualified opportunity funds. Everyone, please feel free to go to our resource page for upcoming meeting links, or if you have additional questions you'd like to ask, please submit them there. And thanks to all for joining us today. We'll be sure to get these slides up on that resource page along with the session that we've had today as well. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.